Kyle Santos had never been the kind of man who sought out recognition or praise. For nearly 2 decades he had worked tirelessly in fire rescue, steadily climbing from rookie responder to chief of operations at Station 12 in the northwest sector of the city. He wasn't charismatic in the conventional sense. He didn't rally the room or charm reporters, but his people respected him for the way he handled pressure, how he kept his voice steady when others yelled, how he walked into fires like he had already, mapped their psychology. Kyle operated by one philosophy: precision over passion, action over impulse. His entire career was a war against chaos, and he'd won most battles not because he was lucky, but because he followed the book until the book became instinct. He lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house tucked into the older part of a suburban district known more for its maze-like residential zoning than for any real sense of community. The streets were narrow, flanked by overgrown hedges and mismatched fences that blurred the boundaries between properties. Some neighbors still waved when you passed. Others had long since retreated into privacy, nodding through tinted windows or ignoring entirely. Kyle didn't mind. He wasn't the neighborhood barbecue type. His schedule didn't allow for it even if he wanted to be. Emergency calls didn't respect dinner time or weekends. He kept his home clean, his grass cut, and his car maintained. That, he figured, was all the social contract required of him. His station covered a wide service area, and that often meant navigating neighborhoods where infrastructure hadn't caught up with population density. Roads too narrow for 2 vehicles, intersections lacking stop signs, fire hydrants hidden behind garden sheds. Most of the time, his team adapted. They ran drills specific to the district, kept updated overlays of the terrain, memorized pinch points and alternate access lanes. But some streets, like Willow Bend Crescent, remained headaches, particularly because of residents like Karen Ramsey. Karen was what one might generously call assertive. A petite woman with a towering presence, she operated a luxury watch resale business from her property, styling her front lawn into what she referred to as a private showroom. She claimed clients preferred a relaxed, intimate atmosphere, which in practice meant blocking street parking with folding signs that read "Client Access Only," stringing decorative rope barriers along her curb, and occasionally confronting anyone who so much as paused too long outside her driveway. Kyle had crossed paths with her before, mostly in the form of complaints. She once reported the fire department for excessive noise during a 2 a.m. response to a house fire 3 doors down. Another time, she threatened to escalate to the mayor's office after a fire truck momentarily stopped near her yard during a training exercise. Most of the crew considered her a nuisance, but harmless. Kyle kept his judgments internal. Despite the friction she caused, Karen knew how to walk the tightrope of local codes. She didn't break the law outright, she skirted it. Her signage was temporary. Her barriers were technically movable. Her business registration was valid, and her connections within the Small Business Bureau made her harder to dismiss as just another cranky neighbor. People like her didn't storm City Hall. They lobbied quietly, nudging policy with smiles and handwritten letters that always began with, "I understand you're very busy, but..." The problem came to a head on an unusually humid Wednesday afternoon. Kyle was overseeing a field drill with a group of new recruits, an evaluation exercise designed to test response time and route logic. They weren't dealing with actual emergencies, but the structure of the simulation mimicked real deployments: rotating calls, random challenges, staggered dispatch. Midway through the drill, a live call interrupted the session. A residential carbon monoxide detector had been triggered in a single-family home. Low risk, but urgent. No one answered the phone, and the automatic alert had gone to Central Dispatch, flagging it as a probable medical emergency. The address was on Willow Bend Crescent. Kyle, acting as supervisor for the day, made the decision to divert the lead vehicle, Engine 3, to respond, with himself joining in a secondary unit. Due to the layout of the street, they had no choice but to park at the bend where driveways converged and the road narrowed into a bottleneck. The angle of approach left one lane partially obstructed. Kyle exited the vehicle, issued the site call to dispatch, and followed his team toward the home. Standard operation. Nothing out of line. Then came the yelling. It cut through the summer haze with an edge that only certain voices carry, trained not just to be heard, but obeyed. Karen Ramsey was outside before the crew had reached the porch of the house in question, storming from her property in wedge sandals and a sleeveless linen top, arms flailing. She demanded to know who had authorized the vehicles to park in front of a licensed business location. She accused Kyle of interfering with private commerce. When one of the rookies tried to defuse her, she shifted tone, claiming harassment and deliberate targeting by city agencies. It escalated rapidly. Kyle had no choice but to step in directly, instructing the younger firefighter to rejoin the team and attempting to hold Karen's attention while the rest continued the call. What struck him wasn't just her entitlement. It was her timing. While a real emergency unfolded 40 feet away, she remained fixed on the position of a single fire truck tire and the notion that it might have scared off an imaginary customer. She refused to let go of the point, even when paramedics arrived and carried out a middle-aged man from the back of the house, pale and semi-conscious. Kyle had dealt with high-strung residents before. He'd been cursed at, shoved, even spat on. But this wasn't outburst. It was performance. Karen saw herself as a figure of authority under siege, and she wanted a stage. That, more than anything, disturbed him. The team completed the extraction. The man was stable and responsive within minutes of receiving oxygen. Once the scene was secure, Kyle filed the necessary paperwork, recorded the delay time due to civilian interference, and prepared a supplemental note for review. He didn't expect it to go far. Most of these things didn't. In his experience, city administration was reluctant to get involved in neighborhood-level disputes unless there were broken laws or broken bones. But that didn't mean he would ignore it. Every moment counted in response work. Seconds lost today could mean lives lost tomorrow. That evening, he returned home later than usual, his uniform still reeking faintly of burnt dust and diesel. He skipped dinner and went straight to his desk, drafting the incident report with clinical detail. No emotional language, no editorializing. Just times, names, actions, and consequences. Before midnight, he filed the document with the department's internal affairs liaison and copied it to the Municipal Safety Board. He almost didn't include the section noting that Karen had physically placed herself between the vehicle and the exit path, claiming her car had priority. But facts were facts. If anyone wanted to challenge his version of events, they'd have to explain away the dashcam footage and the synced timestamps on the call logs. Kyle went to bed not thinking about Karen, but about the man they had pulled from that house. His name was Thomas, early 50s, lived alone. He had no idea his vent system was leaking CO back into the living room until he passed out cold. If they had arrived 3 minutes later, he likely wouldn't have woken up. That was the reality. Not the shouting, not the complaints, not the ego games. Life was fragile, and time didn't care about anyone's property lines. He didn't know it yet, but the incident on Willowbend Crescent would not stay quiet. Karen Ramsey was already making calls, drafting formal complaints, and preparing to reframe the narrative entirely in her favor. She saw an opportunity not just for revenge, but for leverage, and Kyle Santos, whether he liked it or not, had just become her target. 3 days passed without incident, at least on the surface. Kyle resumed his duties, splitting his time between field supervision and administrative work. He processed daily call reports, signed off on engine maintenance logs, reviewed ongoing training schedules for his junior crews, and tried to push the Willowbend Crescent event to the back of his mind. He had seen far worse behavior from residents during high-stress responses, and in most cases, the bureaucracy swept such disruptions under the rug. No officer liked admitting that civilians had interfered with an emergency response. It raised questions, invited scrutiny, and made the chain of command look fragile in the eyes of both the public and the administration. Besides, Kyle had taken the necessary steps, filed the incident report, documented the delay, attached dashcam footage, and noted the potential obstruction in a supplemental file. In his experience, that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The first sign came quietly, in the form of a calendar notification. Kyle had been scheduled for a routine operational review next Tuesday, standard quarterly procedure, but the notice had been updated. The title now read, Special Assessment Review, Incident 3297B, and the time slot had been extended from 45 minutes to 2 full hours. The email came with a generic note from the Municipal Fire Liaison's office requesting his attendance and stating that additional personnel would be present to provide an interdepartmental perspective. Kyle felt the familiar tension crawl up the back of his neck as he reread the phrasing. Additional personnel meant cross-agency presence. Interdepartmental meant legal, political, or worse, media relations. Still, there had been no direct communication from his command staff, no formal warning, and no indication that disciplinary action was in motion. So, for the time being, Kyle kept his posture straight and his voice calm. He didn't change his routine. But the next clue arrived the following morning when a junior administrator from the Fire Bureau stopped by his office under the pretext of verifying asset logs. The man, no older than 30 and too overdressed for station work, asked, pointed, questions about engine deployment that day. What was the exact route? Had there been alternate access points considered? Why had Kyle personally attended the call rather than assigning it to the on-shift captain? Kyle answered professionally, but the pattern was obvious. Someone was building a case, or at least a timeline. It didn't take long to discover the source. That evening, while finishing a shift report in the common room, one of his more experienced lieutenants, Henry Voigt, approached and handed him a folded piece of paper. A printed copy of a formal civilian complaint submitted through the Office of Municipal Accountability. It was signed and time-stamped, bearing Karen Ramsey's name in neatly typed capital letters. The language was strikingly composed, almost sanitized. She alleged intentional obstruction of private enterprise, targeted harassment by a public official, and willful endangerment of non-involved residents through unauthorized vehicle placement. She even included a list of supposed damages. A. Canceled client appointment, a broken flower pot, and emotional distress. Most troubling, however, was her claim that Kyle had refused to identify himself when approached and had instructed subordinates to intimidate and physically restrict her movement on her own property. It was a fabrication, but presented with just enough ambiguity to raise questions. Kyle didn't speak for a long moment after reading it. Henry stood quietly nearby, offering the kind of presence that communicated support without interference. After a while, Kyle set the paper down, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. Karen had always been performative, but now she had escalated from nuisance to formal adversary. She was using the language of bureaucratic systems, not neighborhood gossip. That made her dangerous and effective. The real blow came the next morning. Kyle was midway through a team briefing when the battalion chief arrived in person, something that hadn't happened in nearly a year. Chief Ralston was a blunt man, square-jawed and notoriously unsentimental. He stood in the doorway until Kyle dismissed the team, then motioned for them to speak in private. Inside Kyle's office, the chief handed over an envelope and sat heavily across from him. "Temporary reassignment," he said flatly. "Effective immediately. No field response until further notice." Kyle's hands tightened around the paper. Inside was a formal notice of administrative reassignment pending the outcome of the special review. The language was sterile, but the implication clear. Until the complaint was resolved, Kyle would be confined to internal operations and documentation support. The move wasn't unprecedented. Protocol required a neutral stance when a public-facing complaint was filed against a commanding officer, but it sent a message to the rest of the station. Their leader had been publicly neutralized, pending investigation. Kyle understood the politics of it, but that didn't make it easier to stomach. What made it worse was knowing Karen would consider this a victory. That same day, 2 representatives from the Small Business Advocacy Council arrived at the station, unannounced, requesting to inspect the impact of emergency service operations on licensed home enterprises within the area. Kyle watched from the sidelines as junior officers fielded their questions. He couldn't intervene. He couldn't speak officially. For the first time in his career, he was being made to stand down not because he'd made a mistake, but because someone else had decided the optics were bad enough to warrant action. At home that evening, Kyle reviewed the complaint again, this time analyzing it like a strategist. Karen hadn't just thrown accusations in the dark. She had selected her terms carefully, using phrasing that triggered procedural red flags: endangerment, targeted misconduct, abuse of authority. Her complaint was designed not to win in court but to compel caution from city departments. She didn't want justice, she wanted hesitation, and in that she was succeeding. Kyle knew the next few days would be critical. He couldn't investigate the situation himself. It would violate departmental boundaries and compromise any review. But he could prepare. He spent the weekend compiling every detail from the incident, cross-referencing timestamps, reviewing his dashcam footage frame by frame, checking the synchronization of response logs, and ensuring every action was supported by documentation. He organized the data not to defend himself emotionally, but to build an airtight timeline that left no room for conjecture. Still, a creeping sense of frustration loomed over everything. Not because he was being questioned, he welcomed scrutiny when it was fair, but because the system he had served for so long was now reacting not to facts, but to noise. Karen's voice, amplified through the proper channels, was being treated as equally valid as a real emergency response. It was a distortion of priorities that left Kyle feeling hollow. By Monday, he had received word that the review committee would convene in 3 days. The panel would include representatives from the Office of Emergency Services, the city's Civil Oversight Commission, and a liaison from the Public Relations Department. Karen would not be present, but her attorney would be allowed to submit a statement. Kyle wasn't worried about the content of his defense. He knew his work would stand, but he began to question what the process itself might cost. No. Even if he was cleared, even if the panel deemed his actions appropriate, the shadow of doubt had already taken root. Every officer in his department had seen him pulled from duty. Every resident who heard whispers would assume fire trucks now had political limits. That night, he didn't sleep, not from fear, but from the pressure of helplessness. In the field, there was always something to do, something to carry, to check, to fix. But here, with the paperwork filed and his actions locked behind protocol, he could only wait. Karen Ramsey had played the system like a seasoned player, not by confronting it head-on, but by forcing it to hesitate. And in Kyle's world, hesitation was as deadly as fire. The day of the review hearing arrived beneath a slate-gray sky, the kind of weather that seemed to stall time itself. Kyle arrived at the Municipal Administrative Center in uniform, pressed, formal, spotless, at least outwardly unshaken. Internally, he had long since replaced frustration with focus. He was not here to argue, not here to vindicate himself with emotion. He was here to deliver a report, in the same way he'd walked into burning buildings for years, with composure, clarity, and the full weight of preparation. The room was sterile, rectangular, lit by cold fluorescence, and lined with city-appointed officials seated behind nameplates that marked their respective departments like territories. Most avoided direct eye contact. Some shuffled papers meaninglessly, others checked their tablets. Only one man, a representative from emergency services, an older veteran named Mandel, gave Kyle a quiet nod of recognition. He presented his account methodically: call log timestamps, GPS telemetry, visual documentation, standard operating procedures for residential access in low-clearance zones, and excerpts from the department's own public risk mitigation policy. He didn't editorialize or explain what should have been obvious, that stopping a fire engine to save a life was not a breach of protocol, but the protocol itself. He simply let the data speak. The committee asked procedural questions. Why not dispatch a smaller vehicle? Could a request for temporary access have been submitted? Why was the route chosen that blocked a commercial access point? Kyle answered with maps, route projections, and incident profiles. It was thorough. It was clean. And it was met not with rebuttal, but with silence. The panel thanked him, assured him of a prompt review conclusion, and released him without fanfare. Kyle exited the building with the same calm he'd carried in. But as he reached his car, he spotted something that made his stomach tighten in a way no formal complaint ever had. Parked across the street, just off the municipal lot, was a sleek black SUV with tinted windows and a local business placard in the windshield. Sitting behind the wheel, unmistakable even from a distance, was Karen Ramsey. She wasn't there for the hearing, wasn't on the docket, and had no official reason to be parked outside the administrative center. Yet there she was, leaned back slightly, sipping from a disposable coffee cup and watching the entrance like someone checking off boxes. Kyle didn't acknowledge her. He got in his vehicle and drove away without a glance in her direction. But that image lingered in his mind like smoke after a fire, a quiet confirmation that this conflict had little to do with the incident itself, and everything to do with Karen's need to control the narrative. Her complaint wasn't a plea for fairness. It was strategy. It was step one. Within 48 hours of the hearing, Kyle was notified that his administrative reassignment would continue pending the release of the panel's formal findings, expected within 7 business days. It was standard delay language, buried beneath phrases like departmental coordination and ensuring procedural fairness. But what followed was anything but standard. A memo circulated within his station, unsigned, unattributed, and purely informal, requesting that any future engagements in the Willow Bend Crescent sector involve prior routing approval. That kind of directive didn't exist in operational protocol. It had no legal weight, but it came from somewhere and it spoke volumes. Someone wanted the firehouse to stay away from Karen Ramsey's street unless absolutely necessary. Kyle, of course, saw the danger immediately. If field teams began hesitating or detouring during calls to avoid political complications, lives would be at risk. Yet, when he raised the concern to his division captain, the response was a shrug and a muttered, "Just until things settle." Kyle returned to his desk in silence, but the message was clear. His station was being quietly cautioned to steer clear of future conflict, even at the expense of coverage. Meanwhile, the community itself began to react. Willow Bend Crescent, once merely inconvenient, became a visible example of how a single property owner could weaponize bureaucracy. It started with subtle adjustments. Karen had temporary signage installed stating "Private Commercial Activity in Progress," complete with official-looking formatting that mimicked city permit language. She added collapsible barriers at the edge of her curb, claiming they were part of a client safety initiative. And although none of it technically blocked traffic, the effect was unmistakable. Access was discouraged. Fire, ambulance, or utility, approach at your own risk. What disturbed Kyle even more was how swiftly her behavior normalized in the eyes of the local government. He received word that Karen had filed an application for zoning review, claiming her property had evolved into a mixed-use space and requesting that the city recognize it as such. This maneuver, if approved, would legally redefine her portion of the street as a commercial enclave, giving her new leverage over vehicular access rights, including the ability to restrict non-client entry during posted hours. Kyle read the zoning language carefully and realized she wasn't acting alone. Someone versed in legal infrastructure was helping her. Perhaps a consultant. Perhaps someone inside City Hall. Either way, she was accelerating her campaign from complaint to control. And the impact was real. 1 week later, Station 12 received a delayed call for a diabetic emergency on the same street. The responding engine lost over 3 minutes rerouting around a newly installed temporary construction sign Karen had authorized through her business license. By the time responders reached the residence, the patient was unconscious, and it took 10 additional minutes to stabilize him. The engine captain filed a deviation report. Kyle, still on administrative duty, compiled the case for submission. But the department's official statement blamed the delay on street modifications not anticipated in the original access plan. No names, no accountability. The next escalation came not from Karen, but from within. A junior officer, a young woman named Ellis, approached Kyle after hours. She was visibly tense, clutching a report folder with shaking hands. Inside was a community complaint form, her own, filed after Karen had approached her off-duty at a grocery store and issued what Ellis described as a personal warning. Karen had allegedly told her to choose her loyalties carefully and to remember who can afford attorneys. Ellis had no proof. No witnesses, and the department's legal advisor refused to escalate the issue without corroboration. Kyle was furious, but his hands were tied. He advised Ellis to document every interaction moving forward, to avoid responding to Karen in any unofficial capacity, and to keep her phone recording when possible, even if it couldn't be used as evidence. "Don't let her bait you," he told her. "She doesn't want to fight. She wants a reaction." Despite his forced inaction, Kyle refused to let the narrative rot from the inside. He requested a meeting with the city's emergency logistics coordinator and presented a detailed breakdown of all incidents connected to Willow Bend Crescent in the past 12 months. He included delayed responses, reroutes, equipment impact due to street alterations, and risk analysis projections. His tone remained professional throughout, but his final statement was blunt. "We're not going to wait until someone dies to acknowledge that we've surrendered access to a street because of administrative cowardice." The coordinator, to her credit, listened carefully. She asked for time to evaluate the data and said she would forward the case to the infrastructure team for review. Kyle left the meeting with no promises, but with the sense that his words had at least landed somewhere beyond an inbox. Yet even that momentary optimism was undercut days later when he received another alert. Karen had filed a notice of intent to sue the department, citing emotional trauma, business disruption, and reputational damage. The threat wasn't credible, just another escalation tactic, but it was enough to trigger legal shielding, further freezing internal operations and barring Kyle from making any additional statements or requests related to the matter. She was playing the long game, and it was working. The tension inside the station grew heavier with each passing day. Younger staff whispered behind closed doors, unsure of how far the conflict would reach. Senior officers avoided Kyle's gaze, afraid to be pulled into something they couldn't extricate themselves from. And through it all, Karen's quiet campaign of pressure continued. Complaints, modifications, procedural maneuvers, until the very idea of entering Willow Bend Crescent began to feel like a liability rather than a duty. For Kyle, that shift was the true danger. Not the suspension, not the politics, but the moment when a sworn firefighter hesitated, not because of the flames ahead, but because of the person behind the gate. That was when lives were truly put at risk. And that, more than anything, was what he refused to accept. By the time the formal findings of the departmental review arrived, the damage had already taken root deep enough to be self-sustaining. Kyle received the results on a Monday morning, a carefully worded document that concluded his actions during the Willow Bend Crescent incident were in line with departmental policy and emergency response protocol, and therefore no punitive measures were warranted. The administrative reassignment was to be lifted effective immediately, and Kyle was reinstated to full operational command. On paper, it was an exoneration. In practice, it was closer to a technicality, one that did little to erase the undercurrent of hesitation that now tainted every call near Karen Ramsey's property. Even as he read the words that cleared his name, Kyle understood the deeper reality. Reputations in public service weren't destroyed by verdicts. They eroded in silence, through whispers, glances, and the slow turning of shoulders in meetings. That same afternoon, as if to reassert herself, Karen filed a new construction request for a semi-permanent canopy over the sidewalk bordering her lot, claiming the need to shield her mobile display space from weather-related damage. The installation required a temporary rerouting of foot traffic and, more importantly, added yet another layer of obstruction along a critical access lane. Kyle reviewed the map overlay and saw the trap instantly. This structure, once erected, would push fire engines and ambulances even farther off the street's central line, essentially removing any room for lateral clearance during emergencies. He took it to the planning office and raised the red flag. The clerk blinked at him and said the permit had already been approved under small business development zoning. "It's temporary," she said, as if that rendered the hazard irrelevant. Kyle left the office and drove the route himself, timing every turn, checking angles and clearance margins by eye and by gut. It confirmed his worst fear. If an engine had to turn through that bend during a structure fire, they'd lose over 45 seconds repositioning. Or worse, they'd have to abandon vehicle access and run in manually. That kind of delay could kill someone. It nearly did, just 4 days later. A kitchen fire broke out in a house 2 doors down from Karen's, triggered by a faulty countertop appliance left running overnight. The residents, an older couple in their 70s, were home asleep when the blaze started. The smoke alarms worked. The call came through. Station 12 responded with full code clearance. But by the time they reached the narrowed passage between Karen's new canopy and her still-standing curb barriers, the engine had to stop, adjust, and reposition. The total loss of time: 52 seconds. The wife was pulled out unconscious. The husband suffered second-degree burns to his left arm and shoulder. Both survived. Barely. Kyle filed the incident report before the smoke had cleared. He included dashcam footage, thermal timestamps, and photographic evidence of the bottleneck. He called a meeting with senior command and the city's Safety Oversight Division. He made his argument plainly. If obstruction was now a normalized feature of commercial zoning, the city was complicit in delaying emergency services. But what disturbed him most was the response. There was sympathy. There were promises of further discussion, but no immediate action was taken. The structure remained. The barriers stood. Karen, it seemed, had mastered the art of outlasting outrage by staying just within the boundaries of procedural legitimacy. It was that realization, that legality could become a weapon against logic, that truly shifted Kyle's perspective. Up to that point, he had fought by the book, adhered to chain of command, and trusted that institutional processes would eventually reassert order. But now, standing at the charred edge of a home that could have easily become a coffin, he understood that the system wasn't merely slow. It was vulnerable. And Karen was exploiting that vulnerability with a precision he had underestimated. She wasn't irrational. She was methodical. Every sign, every filing, every objection, even her complaints, they were coordinated to create a layered shield of delay and confusion around her territory. She wasn't trying to win a confrontation. She was trying to make confrontation impossible by hiding behind constant procedural ambiguity. Kyle realized he needed help, but not from within the department and not from sympathetic officials offering quiet words. He needed strategic coordination from someone with reach, someone with authority over the entire system of urban emergency logistics. That person turned out to be Director Hannah Merritt, the head of Regional Emergency Routing Operations, a woman known for her analytical mind and her intolerance for performative politics. She had worked in logistics during hurricane response in the South, dealt with impassable zones and disaster zones, and had no patience for manufactured gridlock in residential neighborhoods. Kyle requested a consultation and presented his compiled data: cumulative delay times, modified street schematics, legal permit overlays, projected response losses, and risk assessments showing that the area now posed a disproportionate threat to both residents and responders. Merritt reviewed the materials in silence, occasionally tapping her pen against the desk but offering no commentary. When Kyle finished, she asked a single question. "Has anyone above zoning ever approved an alternate status for that section of road?" Kyle shook his head. "Then I'll need the raw permit trail," she said. "I want every revision, every timestamp, and the name on each approval signature." Within 24 hours, her office had a working map of the bureaucratic manipulation Karen had orchestrated. Most permits were valid, but they were stacked in a way that created conflicting boundaries. Merritt saw through it instantly. "She's not blocking access directly," she said. "She's rerouting responsibility until no one knows who owns the access." For the first time in weeks, Kyle felt the ground shift. This wasn't a moral crusade anymore. It was now a jurisdictional puzzle. And Merritt was the kind of person who solved puzzles not with debate, but with structural override. She coordinated with the Transportation Department and filed a formal request to audit all mixed-use reclassifications in the area. It was a move that couldn't be linked to Kyle directly, but would put every inch of Karen's territorial manipulation under review. Kyle remained publicly silent. He returned to active duty without fanfare, focusing on training, response drills, and rotating shifts. But behind the scenes, the machine had begun to move. Not quickly and not loudly, but with the quiet force of someone who had seen this game played before and was ready to dismantle it piece by piece. Still, Karen didn't stop. She filed a public records request for all internal communications involving Kyle over the past 3 months. She requested body cam footage from the night of the kitchen fire, even though she wasn't directly involved. She began circulating quiet accusations through local business groups that Kyle was running a personal vendetta against small enterprise. And, perhaps most chillingly, she submitted a motion through her legal counsel requesting a public safety impact inquiry on Kyle's presence in her vicinity, an administrative maneuver that, if accepted, could restrict his command over operations involving her block. It was absurd. It was theater. But it forced a procedural hold on his authority for that grid sector. That night, as Kyle reviewed the mounting stack of documentation, he didn't feel defeated. He felt sharpened. Karen had moved from obstruction to encroachment, and now, for the first time, she had stepped far enough into the web of overlapping departments that her trail could be followed, not emotionally, but operationally. And thanks to Merritt, the audit would be thorough, brutal, and driven not by vengeance, but by logistics. Kyle didn't need to be the loudest voice anymore. He just needed to make sure the right levers kept turning. Kyle had thought he'd seen the worst of it. After the audit was green-lit and Hannah Merritt's office began quietly dissecting the permit web that Karen Ramsey had constructed, he believed the battle had shifted decisively. Not won, but at least entering a phase where logic and regulation would finally outweigh manipulation and noise. The audit wasn't public, and the city wasn't broadcasting its findings, but internally, documents had begun to surface. Permit inconsistencies, improperly classified structures, overlapping jurisdiction conflicts that should have voided several of Karen's modifications outright. Kyle didn't expect a sudden resolution. Bureaucracy, even when moving in the right direction, was a slow machine. But the mere fact that someone was finally pulling the thread gave him hope that the road ahead, while still murky, at least pointed toward a finish line. That illusion lasted less than a week. On a rainy Thursday morning, Kyle was summoned not to a city department, not to a fire command briefing, but to civil court. A summons had been hand-delivered to Station 12, served by a private processor wearing a bright yellow poncho who looked more like a delivery man than a legal messenger. Kyle accepted it, confused but calm, until he read the document. It wasn't a code violation, or an appeal hearing, or a zoning complaint. It was a civil suit. Karen Ramsey had filed a personal lawsuit against him. Not the department, not the city. Him, individually, Kyle Santos, named as the sole defendant in a claim alleging negligence, property interference, emotional distress, and defamation. It wasn't about money, though the filing listed damages in 6 figures. It was about leverage. If Karen couldn't get him reassigned, couldn't outmaneuver the system directly, she would isolate him with legal liability. In effect, she was making him radioactive, dangerous to support, expensive to defend, and politically complicated for any superior to fully back without hesitation. The suit itself was thin, an assembly of exaggerated claims and invented harms, but it was dressed up in all the legal language needed to pass the minimum threshold for review. Karen's attorney had attached footage of the emergency response on Willowbend Crescent, spliced with images of her property before and after the event, paired with claims that Kyle's presence had caused irreversible reputational damage to a recognized small business entity. There were screenshots of local message board threads where residents had mocked Karen's complaints, which the lawsuit attempted to attribute to Kyle's influence. She alleged that his handling of the fire call had triggered a cascade of online bullying, lost clientele, and personal trauma requiring therapy. Kyle read the pages slowly, each line more surreal than the last, until he reached the final clause, a request for a restraining order against him as an unfit and actively harmful municipal actor. It was absurd, it was offensive, and it was tactically brilliant. Even without merit, the lawsuit triggered a series of mandatory responses. City legal counsel had to assign representation. The fire department had to file internal liability statements. Kyle was required to produce all communications related to Karen over the past 90 days. And while none of this implied guilt, it imposed burden. Meetings, depositions, time off duty, delays, risk. Karen hadn't just sued him. She had activated a pressure protocol that would slow him down, drain his resources, and isolate him just enough to make his leadership feel like a liability to everyone around him. Kyle could feel it already. Officers avoiding eye contact, administrators speaking cautiously, senior staff referring questions to legal. He wasn't losing his position, but the air around him had thickened. Everything moved with friction. He wasn't alone, however. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly, and not everyone bought Karen's framing. Hannah Merritt's team, despite not being named in the suit, accelerated their audit, requesting additional documents from zoning and compliance offices tied to Karen's street permits. One evening, Merritt herself called Kyle. Not formally, not through any recorded channel, but personally. "They're burying the street in paperwork," she said bluntly. 3 of her permits conflict with public safety access laws. 1 is backdated. If we can prove she knowingly filed with false precedents, we've got grounds to void every structure she's installed in the past 2 years. That wasn't just a bureaucratic maneuver, it was a tactical one. If Merritt's team could prove intentional fraud, even at a low level, it would shift the balance entirely. The city would be obligated to act. Kyle didn't cheer or react emotionally. He just said, "Let me know what you need," and returned to work. But Karen wasn't done. The day before Kyle's first court-mandated deposition, a flyer began circulating in the neighborhood, cheaply printed, black and white, clearly designed to appear grassroots. The title read, "Is your safety being sacrificed for personal ego?" Beneath it was a photo of Kyle, taken from a public ceremony months earlier, cropped and poorly lit. The text accused him of prioritizing personal vendettas over emergency access, of targeting local businesswomen with unnecessary force, and of causing panic among neighbors afraid to call for help. It was unsigned, unclaimed, and riddled with grammatical errors, but its effect was immediate. Several residents, already wary after weeks of tension, began contacting the station with vague complaints, requesting not to have Kyle on calls involving their properties. The department didn't honor the requests officially, but the message was received. Kyle knew this tactic. It was asymmetrical pressure, death by reputation, not confrontation. Karen didn't need the flyer to be legally valid. She needed it to introduce doubt, to create social fog around Kyle's leadership. She was playing in the court of perception, and every whisper mattered. Still, Kyle refused to retreat. During his deposition, he answered clearly, methodically, with precise language and no emotion. He stuck to facts, cited logs, referenced protocols. Karen's attorney, a slick man in a tailored navy suit, tried to provoke him, asking questions about his personal opinions, suggesting he had a pattern of overstepping in residential areas. Kyle didn't flinch. He responded with the calm of a man who had spent his life pulling people out of burning buildings, not explaining himself to people who'd never worn a turnout coat. Outside the room, he was met by Merritt's deputy, who handed him a sealed envelope. "We finished the first pass," she said. Inside was a copy of the audit's interim findings, 4 permit inconsistencies, 2 of which directly violated emergency access ordinances. One was filed with a zoning code that didn't exist. Another overlapped with a public utility corridor, making it legally unenforceable. The report hadn't been released yet. It would go through legal review first, but once it did, it would undermine Karen's entire infrastructure. Every sign, every structure, every artificial constraint she had built would be subject to removal. That wasn't speculation. That was regulation. But even that victory came with complications. Karen preempted the report's release by filing a motion for injunction, claiming that any action against her structures would constitute retaliation and gender-based harassment. She claimed the audit itself was biased, based on known affiliations between city logistics and fire department interests. It was wild. It was desperate. But it was also procedurally valid. The city now had to pause its enforcement timeline until a hearing could be held to determine whether her claims of bias had merit. Another delay, another window. Meanwhile, Kyle's world continued shrinking. He was still on active duty, still technically in command, but operational limitations had crept in. Certain routes were now rerouted, pending litigation. He was no longer allowed to directly supervise responses near Karen's zone. His calls had to be logged twice, once through standard dispatch and again through legal. His team still respected him, but morale was fragile. The younger officers were visibly nervous. No one wanted to be the next target of a surprise lawsuit or a viral accusation. The weight of unspoken fear hung thick in the air. Then came the second fire. This time, it wasn't near Karen's house. It was on the opposite end of the grid, a 2-story duplex where faulty wiring sparked a nighttime blaze. Kyle responded personally. His team moved fast, cleared the building, and neutralized the fire with minimal damage. Textbook operation. But as they were packing up, a patrol car arrived. The officer, visibly uncomfortable, handed Kyle a notice. He was being temporarily suspended from on-site operations pending review of his legal status in an ongoing civil suit. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had pulled the trigger. The motion for restriction had been granted. Kyle wasn't fired, but he was grounded. That night he sat alone in his office, watching the red and amber glow of distant city lights through a rain-streaked window. His uniform still smelled of smoke. His boots were still wet. He'd done nothing wrong. And yet he had been rendered inert, not by failure, not by error, but by the slow erosion of public confidence engineered by a woman who'd never once had to carry someone out of a burning building. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat there, still as stone, as the weight of what had been taken from him settled into his bones. And somewhere, not far from that office, Karen Ramsey sat in her pristine living room, sipping wine beneath the awning that should have never been allowed to stand, believing she had finally won. The turning point didn't arrive with a declaration or courtroom drama. It came with a dull administrative thud, buried beneath layers of paperwork, triggered not by rage or confrontation, but by the activation of a mechanism that Karen Ramsey had never fully understood: structural oversight. 2 weeks after Kyle was suspended from field operations, the municipal auditor's full report was finalized, reviewed, and signed off by the city's legal department. Its findings were extensive, detailed, and damning. It revealed that multiple permits Karen had submitted had been based on non-existent zoning codes, improperly certified inspections, and one instance where a digital signature had been affixed retroactively, a forgery under administrative law, even if it wasn't criminally prosecuted. The report didn't label her actions as fraudulent in the criminal sense, but it used terms like material misrepresentation, intentional concealment of operational impact, and cumulative obstruction of emergency protocols. In bureaucratic terms, it was a body blow. In regulatory terms, it was a blueprint for demolition. Hannah Merritt didn't leak the findings. She didn't need to. She followed procedure. Her office forwarded the file to the Department of Public Infrastructure with a recommendation for emergency revocation of access modifications in the Willow Bend Crescent sector, citing immediate public safety risk. She copied the mayor's office. She included an annotated timeline showing delays caused by Karen's modifications, including the kitchen fire response and the diabetic emergency. She attached GIS overlays, time-stamped footage, and a legal assessment recommending not just removal of structures, but a moratorium on private commercial zoning adjustments in high-risk residential sectors. She acted not as an ally to Kyle, but as an official executing her mandate. The next morning, Karen Ramsey received a notice of removal, a formal directive requiring her to dismantle her canopy, retract her barriers, and suspend all business-related exterior installations pending review. She had 72 hours to comply before city crews would enforce the directive. Kyle, still off the rotation board, heard about it secondhand, sitting in the department's resource planning office, updating supply schedules. He didn't react outwardly, but inside, a quiet tension broke loose. It wasn't vindication, not yet. But it was the first visible sign that the balance had shifted. Karen, of course, did not comply. Instead, she filed for an emergency injunction, arguing that the removal order constituted retaliation for her civil complaint against Kyle and that the timing of the enforcement violated due process. Her attorneys claimed the audit was biased and demanded an independent review. But the court wasn't interested in the optics. It looked at documentation. It reviewed timestamps, permit irregularities, GIS data. It saw an area where fire engines had been forced to reroute 5 times in 4 months. It read through interviews from responders describing lost time, chaotic access, and near misses. It listened to the recording of the 911 operator during the kitchen fire call, noting the increased panic in her voice as units struggled to reach the scene. And then it rejected the injunction. The city moved in. Crews arrived early, escorted by a pair of compliance officers and a marked patrol car. They dismantled the canopy within hours. The barriers were loaded onto flatbeds. Karen stood on her lawn, flanked by 2 assistants and a camera crew she had hired, documenting the process as if it were a political persecution. But no one intervened. No protest formed. No neighbors emerged to speak on her behalf. The street, once divided and tense, stood still as the machinery of order reclaimed it. For Kyle, the moment was both surreal and subdued. He watched the footage later that evening in the operations lounge, surrounded by a handful of off-duty staff who said nothing, but whose silence felt different now. Less wary, more resolved. The air had shifted, and yet his reinstatement didn't come that day. There were still formalities, reviews, internal checklists to complete, but something unspoken had changed. The pressure had broken not from force, but from exposure. Karen hadn't just lost the argument. She had lost her aura of invincibility, and in a system where fear often carried more weight than facts, that loss was everything. Still, the fallout wasn't over. Karen escalated again, this time in desperation. She amended her lawsuit to include allegations of targeted defamation, claiming that the removal of her property was not a public safety act, but a character attack orchestrated by Kyle and his associates. She added names: Merritt, Voigt, Even, Ellis. The document ballooned in size, filled with contradictions and unverified claims. Her lawyer filed a motion for an emergency deposition, trying to drag Kyle back into court, but this time city legal pushed back. With the audit now public, with the ruling in favor of removal, the burden of evidence had shifted. The court denied the expansion, citing lack of merit. Karen's attorney withdrew within the week, citing irreconcilable strategy differences. It was a quiet collapse masked by legal language, but it marked the true end of her offensive. Kyle's reinstatement was processed 3 days later. It wasn't dramatic. A simple document, countersigned by the division chief, reactivating his command clearance and authorizing him for full operational leadership. No speech, no apology, just a return to what had always been his role. He reviewed the call sheets, adjusted the engine schedules, and walked the floor of the apparatus bay like it was the first time again. His team didn't say much, but when he stepped into the truck on his first call back, a routine gas leak alert on the east side, every seat was filled. No empty spots, no dropouts, no tension, just presence. The call turned out to be nothing, an old pipe valve misfiring. But as Kyle ran the post check with his crew, one of the younger firefighters, someone who'd joined after the original incident, asked him, quietly, if it had been worth it, all the waiting, all the procedural fights, all the months of silence. Kyle didn't answer right away. He looked at the open street, the clear approach, the absence of obstacles. Then he said, "If we lose ground once, we lose it every time. So, yeah, it's worth it." It wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't heroic. It was simply true. And somewhere, in a now-empty storefront with peeling signage and shuttered awnings, Karen Ramsey sat alone, the silence around her louder than any lawsuit she'd ever filed. The weeks that followed unfolded without fanfare, but for Kyle, each day felt heavier with meaning than the last. The city didn't host a ceremony. No medals were issued, and no press release acknowledged what had happened on Willowbend Crescent. The system didn't celebrate course corrections. It simply absorbed them and moved on. But beneath that quiet, something had shifted. The barriers were gone, not just the physical ones, but the procedural haze that had crept into the department like mold. Emergency calls from that sector resumed without incident. No additional special routing requests were issued. No new zoning surprises appeared on access maps. Kyle monitored the logs obsessively at first, waiting for the next maneuver, the next manufactured delay. But nothing came. Silence returned, not as a threat, but as an absence of sabotage. Karen Ramsey, for her part, remained silent too. Her lawsuit against Kyle was quietly withdrawn after her new attorney failed to secure an extension. The civil complaint dissolved under the weight of its own contradictions, unsupported by evidence and eclipsed by the audit's findings. The city did not pursue her for fraud, likely in exchange for a non-contestation agreement, but her business license was not renewed. Her front lawn, once staged like a luxury exhibit, now stood bare, the grass yellowing in patches where the canopy had once cast shade. Neighbors reported she rarely left her home, and the few times she did, she avoided eye contact, moving through public space like a shadow of the woman who once shouted across driveways about rights and boundaries. No one mourned her retreat. Kyle didn't revel in her silence. He didn't seek it. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was something far simpler than victory. He wanted to do his job without interference. He wanted seconds to matter again, without having to weigh them against someone's entitlement. And slowly, the department recalibrated. New policies were drafted to prevent repeat scenarios. Permits involving emergency access routes now triggered automatic review by logistics officers, and any alterations to mixed-use properties near critical zones required sign-off from public safety representatives. It wasn't radical reform, but it was enough. The machine had learned, not loudly, but deeply. In the firehouse, things returned to their rhythm. Calls came, engines rolled, drills resumed. Kyle began noticing moments again. The crisp coordination of a ladder deployment, the subtle tension in a new recruit's jaw as he waited for a command, the calm that settled in the back of a truck just before the siren wailed. These were the things that had brought him here, that had kept him here, long before he ever knew Karen Ramsey's name. The job was never about glory. It was about timing, discipline, clarity under pressure. Now, without interference, that clarity was coming back. Still, the impact hadn't fully faded. Kyle remained aware of how quickly perception could be turned, how fragile the thread of trust really was. One rumor, one clip, one complaint, and the weight of years could be overturned. So he carried himself with even more precision now. Fewer jokes, fewer assumptions. Every report submitted on time, every action documented. Not out of fear, but because he understood the stakes better than most. Fire didn't need to burn a building to destroy it. Sometimes it just had to make people hesitate. His job was to remove that hesitation, by example, by protocol, and by sheer consistency. He never spoke to Karen again. He never saw her in person after the last structure was removed. But one afternoon, as he returned from a routine inspection, he passed her property in an unmarked vehicle, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass. She didn't react. No rage, no contempt, just a kind of distant vacancy, like someone trying to remember who they used to be. Kyle didn't linger. He didn't gloat. He drove on. What mattered was that the route was open, clear, accessible, the kind of street where, if a life needed saving, there'd be nothing in the way. That was enough.